While they tear down and burn the American flag in Egypt and shout death to America, Joe Manchin votes to provide U.S. taxpayer aid to Egypt. While Pakistan imprisons and tortures the hero who helped us get Osama bin Laden, Joe Manchin votes to send billions of our taxpayer dollars to Pakistan. While radical Islamists burn our embassy and kill our ambassador in Libya, Joe Manchin votes to send more taxpayer money to Libya.
You are listening to the Laura Ingraham Show, 800-876-4123, a little bit under the weather here in New York. And if I'm in New York, it means it is raining. Which it is, of course. And that was a Rand Paul ad from Rand Paul PAC against, this is a Joe Manchin deal. And it was, well, we've talked about this, folks. The Republican Party has found itself tethered to the Bush approach to foreign policy. I'm not talking about peace through strength and having a strong military. I'm talking about this more of an idea that you have to be interventionist in the Middle East in order to be successful and protect American interests. And I just want to remind people that both Afghanistan and Iraq ended up being incredibly unpopular wars and not successful. And at a time when we have $16 trillion of debt, we've been running $1 trillion deficit for 4 years, and deficits before that under Bush. I think Mitt Romney's got to be very careful how he formulates his foreign policy, especially in this last debate, because you don't want to scare people away from thinking, wow, wait a second, we thought he was Mr. Fix-It, now he's going to go bringing us into Syria as well. I think a lot of people are worried about that, and I think Barack Obama is going to set a trap that I hope Mitt Romney avoids. Joining us now, Rand Paul is with us, Senator from the great state of Kentucky. Senator Paul, great to talk to you, sir.
Good morning, Laura.
Let's talk about what your problem is with the Romney foreign policy approach. And look, I think you and I are kind of on the same page here when it comes to how we need to approach the Middle East. And let me give you the counterpoint, though. The counterpoint is, look, we're leading from behind. America's interests are not being advanced currently in the Middle East as Barack Obama sits on his haunches and lets the world community have its way.
Well, I think the problem, particularly with regard to Syria, is that we need to know, one, who we're supporting, but two, we need to go about it constitutionally. No president should unilaterally send in arms, troops, or begin a war in Syria without the approval of Congress. But then even if we decide it's something that's going to happen when we debate it, we have to decide, are these people our friends or our foes? I mean, after a decade in Afghanistan, we have trouble telling whether or not the officers we're training for the Afghan army are our friends or our foes. We've had over 50 deaths from soldiers we're training, and in Syria, I'm unclear. Will they have a law that says blasphemy is a death crime, is a death penalty? In Pakistan recently, they arrested a little girl with Down syndrome and said she was burning the Quran. A 14-year-old girl or maybe 12-year-old girl was arrested for blasphemy. There's another Christian woman in Pakistan on death row for blasphemy. And how do the Christians feel about the war?
We just lost something in what you said. How did the Christians feel about what?
How do the Christians feel about the war in Syria? When the war erupted in Iraq, most of the Christians in Iraq fled to Syria. So Syria has a significant Christian population. News reports have said that the Christians in Syria are wary of the rebels and aren't participating on either side of this war.
We're talking to Rand Paul here on the Laura Ingraham Show. And Senator Paul, I find it strange, to say the least, that given what happened in 2008, in 2006 and 2008, with Republicans getting turned out during the last term of the Bush administration, and then we elected the most left-wing person ever to become president, who campaigned on ending these unpopular wars, and especially the war in Iraq, and yet it's like the last 10 years never happened to Republicans. And Mitt Romney, I think, had some great moments in that foreign policy speech, but he's clearly getting his advice from people who worked in the Bush administration, worked in the Bush campaigns, and they're focused in that same direction. What specifically do you think are the pitfalls of that approach, that kind of old Bush approach?
Well, when I've met and discussed with Governor Romney foreign policy, I've gotten a much more reasoned response, a response that seems to be more reluctant to go to war, and that's why I'm supporting him. However, in those speeches, I think you're right. I think they're being written by the same people who came right out of the Bush administration. And during the debates, though, during the Republican debates, Governor Romney said that he was for coming home from Afghanistan, which the vast majority of people are ready to come home from now. But rattling the sabers over there and saying that I'm more likely to take us to war in Syria or Iran is a bad political strategy, but it's also a bad strategy for our country.
Well, I think, again, people hear foreign aid and they're common sense, right? You want to loan people money or give people money because they'll really use it for good purposes. And yet, when they see things unraveling in the Middle East as they are, and then they're like, wait a second, we give them how much money? I think just the regular person out there, maybe not very political, can't believe it. And they can't understand it.
What amazes me is I had an amendment that would have placed conditions on aid. Wouldn't have even completely ended the aid. I think really we ought to end most of the aid to countries that don't like us, that burn our flag and disrespect us. However, all I was asking is that they pledge that they will and can protect our embassy, that they turn over the assassins who killed our ambassador, and that in Pakistan's case, that they release the doctor who helped us get bin Laden. I think those are pretty minimal conditions, and they would still have gotten their aid. And yet, I got overwhelming opposition, and so we're running some ads right now in 4 or 5 different battleground states letting people know that their senator, amidst all of this violence in the Middle East, is continuing to send U.S. taxpayer dollars to countries that basically don't appear to like us.
I want you to react to a couple of different sound bites from Mitt Romney at this foreign policy speech this week. Let's listen.
In Egypt, I'll use our influence, including clear conditions on our aid, to urge the new government to represent all Egyptians, to build democratic institutions, and to maintain its peace treaty with Israel. And we must persuade our friends and allies to place similar stipulations on their aid.
So he says stipulations are fine. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think it's a step in the right direction that he is saying that, but many will argue that we already have conditions. For example, Egypt is supposed to meet certain human rights conditions now and democratic sort of goals or objectives, but Hillary Clinton simply says they are. But she said they were meeting these conditions even when they were holding 16 Americans over there on political charges. She says this while they're still holding political prisoners in their country. They say they're meeting their goals while the crime of blasphemy is something that you can be put to death for. Basically, criticizing Islam is a death penalty crime in most of these countries, and I don't consider that to be democracy in the form that I'm concerned with.
And Governor Romney also said this.
In Syria, I'll work with our partners to identify and organize those members of the opposition who share our values, and then ensure that they obtain the arms they need to defeat Assad's tanks and helicopters and fighter jets. It's essential that we develop influence with those forces in Syria that will one day lead a country that sits at the heart of the Middle East.
So he said we'll identify our allies in the Syria rebel community. I don't know how we specifically do that, but is that the part that you're most skeptical of?
Yes, and I think the problem is in identifying them, because even in Afghanistan, where we've been there a dozen years almost, we have trouble identifying who our friends are and who our foes are. The soldiers that we train on a daily basis turn and shoot us when our backs are turned, and I think it's very difficult in Syria where we're not involved. But a real question you have to ask is, why are the Christians sort of either siding with Assad or not participating at all in the rebellion? Because Christians flocked to Syria because they thought Syria was a better place to live than the Iraq after the war we had in Iraq, because the Muslim government in Iraq they felt was going to be less tolerant than Assad's government. So really, I think it's more complicated than that, the Syrian rebels are these great freedom fighters that are going to have sort of a pro-Western democracy. There's a chance that out of all of this Arab Spring and out of all of these revolts, we wind up with Islamic governments that are much less friendly to the West throughout the Middle East. So while I'm all for them fighting for democracy, we need to be a little aware. And I usually judge it this way. Would I send my son to fight with the Syrian rebels? I don't know. I don't know if the Syrian rebels are good people or bad people, or necessarily whether they stand for any kind of Western freedoms. I know they don't like Assad, but that sounds more like their fight than it does the world's fight.
The New York Times today, Rand Paul, has a headline, U.S. military sent to Jordan on Syria crisis. The U.S. military has secretly sent a task force of more than 150 planners and other specialists to Jordan to help the armed forces there handle a flood of Syrian refugees and then prepare for the possibility that Syria will lose control of its chemical weapons and be positioned should the turmoil in Syria expand into a wider conflict.
I'm concerned about the excursions into Turkey. I'm concerned about NATO being drawn into this. You know, I think the a border skirmish between Syria and Turkey is not something that should involve the entire world through NATO. And I am concerned, when Princeps killed the Archduke Ferdinand, it started out something very small, but then everybody mobilized and put their troops on everyone's borders. And I worry about mobilizations and, expansion of the war to involve all of the world's powers.
Senator Paul, who's with you on this in the Senate? Are there any other Republicans who are standing with you?
Well, on ending the war in Afghanistan, we sent a letter to the president, and Senator Mike Lee from Utah and I signed this letter with 16 Democrats. So there are more Democrats than Republicans, but I think there is a growing concern, particularly with the war in Afghanistan. See, I was all for going to Afghanistan. I think people cannot be allowed to attack us. I think that we needed to wipe them out so they wouldn't attack us again, and also basically in reparation for what they did to us. However, 10 years later, I don't believe in nation building. I don't think it's working, and I'm really saddened by the stories of American soldiers being killed by
we've been interviewing a lot of the family members. Yeah, we've been interviewing a lot of the family. So other than Mike Lee, is there anyone with you on the foreign aid issue? Because, I just want to remind people, Rand Paul is not saying that America's military should be severely reduced or that we shouldn't have peace through strength. You're not saying any of that. You're saying we should advance our interests where practicable, but simply not engage in scenarios that are beyond our abilities and beyond our understanding. Because I can tell you what people are going to say after this segment. You're for isolationism and you're for retreating in the face of these terrorist threats, and the world is more dangerous. You need to advance against them, not retreat. I know that's what they're going to say.
Well, what I would say is the most important thing the federal government does, the most important constitutional duty is defense of our country, and that if I were in charge, no one would attack us. No one would attack us with impunity, and we would repel all invaders. We would seek them to the far ends of the earth, but we wouldn't go looking for preemptive war or get involved in local squabbles unless Congress and the people voted to declare war. That's why I think it's important how our founding fathers set this up. If the overwhelming mood of our country is that they are for a war, we vote for it in our Congress, we declare war, and then the president executes it, we win it, but then we come home. I think we don't stay for decade after decade after decade because we don't have the money to do it, and I think sometimes it's counterproductive. Overwhelmingly, if you look at now what polls say as far as the war, probably 70-80% of Democrats think it's time to come home, but over 50% of Republicans now think it's time to come home. I talked to congressmen who have always been the best supporters of our military and our soldiers, and I talked to one the other day on the plane to Washington. He said he's just about ready to publicly start calling for them to come home. So the mood is shifting, but we need to get more Republicans to say it is time to come home from Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, I think the question stands. I mean, would you have your son fighting alongside the Afghan security forces today? Or your daughter?
I think that's exactly the question.
And Senator Rand Paul, hey, we appreciate it very much. Kind of a voice crying in the wilderness on this, but I think there are a lot of people, the actual voters in this country, who are with Rand Paul. Thank you, Senator. We're going to take a break on the Laura Ingraham Show. Chris Christie about to join us.